to testify here. So what I would like to ask all the conferees for both these bills is to keep your comments to 2 to 3 minutes because we got a lot of people. I want to make sure they all get the chance to talk. Committee, what we'll do is we'll do all the proponents and then we'll field questions. Then we'll do all the neutrals and then we'll do all the opponents and field questions. So rather than, hopefully that'll make it go a little bit quicker. All right, so I'm going to open the hearing on House Bill 2572 and we'll start with a rundown from the reviser.
Mike Heim with the Reviser Statutes Office. You're getting a summary of the bill, which is really the title of the bill provides the best summary. It says relating to advanced voting ballots and the return thereof, requiring personal delivery and photographic identification of any person delivering advanced ballots on behalf of other voters. That the gist of the bill is on page 2, and it amends current law to provide that the voted ballot may be delivered by another person designated in writing by the voter. There has to be a written designation and so on, and it has to be delivered to the county election officer before the close of polls on election day. The individual delivering the ballot shall do so in person, shall present photo identification at the time the ballot is delivered. The county election officer shall photograph the individual with each ballot the individual is delivering, record the individual's personal information as stated on the photo identification, and no such ballot shall be delivered by the individual to a remote ballot box or other container identified. So it limits that. The other amendments basically are conforming to that. There's 3 other sections in the bill that are amended, but if you've got questions, I'll try and answer.
All right, committee, are there any questions for Reviser Heim, Representative Collins, and then Representative Oropesa?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Would this exempt postal employees, who are delivering ballots to the courthouse?
It doesn't deal with postal employees as such. They're not, I mean, they're delivering the mail. I don't think they're covered by this.
Well, I was just wondering if, that might be a technicality that could come up or something.
I don't think it's needed. You can ask the Secretary of State's office, but I don't think that's an issue.
All right, thank you.
Okay. Representative Oropesa.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. In regards to is it the county clerk, the commissioner, who's ever taking this personal information from who's ever dropping off this ballot, and they are now in charge of that? Are they open to liability if they should lose that personal information or have something happen with someone's personal information, say their license and their license number?
That's not covered by the bill.
Are they open for liability then? If it's not covered by the bill, are the clerks and the commissioners and poll workers open for liability ultimately for loose identification?
Well, the identification would be taking a photograph and personal information, which I assume is the name and so on. I don't know where the liability would come in all honesty, but it doesn't really address how this information is stored or how long or what the consequences might be if there's some type of breach. I assume you're not going to ask for a social security number, for example, but I don't know.
Okay, thank you.
Representative Neighbor and then Representative Hoagland.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My question is, in reading your summation or summary on this, it sounds like, and this is a point of clarification, if I were to take a mail-in ballot to a drop box and put it in, I would then have to have a picture and all of that, or if it's only I'm taking it for someone else. This does not seem
The individual that is voting can drop it off in a box, but if you're taking it on behalf of someone else, the bill requires that you take it to the election officer and you be identified.
Okay, I guess I don't read it quite like that, but I'll ask as we go on.
Well, and I don't know if my summary may not be as clear as it needs to.
No, it's probably me. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Representative Hoagland.
Thank you. So you made the statement that we don't know where any of the photos or any of the identification is going to be stored, right?
I think it would be up to the county election officers to determine how to do that. You know, the bill, you can amend it. If this thing would be passed out of committee, you can make amendments to it. The Secretary of State may provide some guidelines for this. I'm not real clear, but the bill doesn't address it.
So it's possible it'd be a mandated expense for the counties,
I'm sorry, I didn't.
an unfunded mandate to the counties to have the,
I'm
someone.
not sure. Well, I mean, you'd have to buy the camera, you'd have to provide some type of storage and so on, and you'd have to have someone taking the pictures, so there may be extra, or there would be extra work.
Okay, committee, this will be the last one because we do actually have conferees that probably would be better to answer some of these questions, but go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm sorry, I was just reading through this and I didn't see what the purpose of this would be, like where, if you're going to store the photo identification and collect the information, who is going to be accessing that information and for what purpose?
If I understand the purpose of the bill, it is to provide more election security and to prevent folks from stuffing remote ballot boxes and so on. If you've we're going to return a ballot on behalf of someone else, you've got to do it in person with the county election office. That's the purpose of the bill, and that, at least that's my understanding of what it's all about.
I think the bringer of this bill was concerned about enforcement of the 10 ballot limit, because you'll remember a couple years ago we passed a bill that said you could only deliver 10 ballots that weren't your own. I think that's the intent, but hopefully the proponents will have more on that. Okay, I want to get to the conferees committee, so we're going to go ahead and move on. And my first proponent is Chad Ennis, who's on WebEx. Sir, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Thank you, Chairman.
Please go ahead, sir.
Thank you. I'm Chad Ennis. I'm with the Honest Elections Project. We're an organization for transparency and accountability in elections. In my former life, I was the auditor for the Texas Secretary of State. So I do know a little bit about election procedure and election problems that come up. And what I view this bill as doing is creating a gap or fixing a gap in chain of custody. When we audited counties in Texas, we saw gaps in chain of custody. And every time of ballots and different election materials, and every time you have one of those gaps, you create a spot where someone can come in and claim fraud, can claim conspiracy, can claim any other nefarious purposes. This bill does a good job of closing some of those gaps. So a gap is where a ballot shows up, it's returned, and we don't know its origin. Well, we can fix that by recording who brought it in and who in their information, so they can be contacted later, that kind of thing. If needed, probably won't be needed. So I think that's the main thing the bill does. I think it's an important thing. We've seen problems with this, and it actually led in Bridgeport, Connecticut, to an election being overturned where there were allegations, and it was actually a guilty plea where folks brought in multiple ballots to drop boxes. The origin of the ballots weren't known, so therefore the court ended up overturning that election, and they had to redo a primary because of it. So that's why we're in favor of this bill, and I'd be happy to take any questions.
All right, committee, I don't have anybody else listed to speak as a proponent. We do have a written testimony from Carrie Sue Vosberg I'd direct the committee's attention to at a later time. Is there anybody else wishing to speak as a proponent before we open up for questions for proponents? Okay, seeing none. Committee, are there any questions for Mr. Ennis? Representative Oropeza.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you for your testimony today. Do you have any data for Kansas, the state of Kansas?
We don't have any. I looked and was unable to find any convictions in this area for Kansas. We've seen Brennan's Dinner. Heritage Foundation has a voter fraud database. 5 years ago, Brennan Center went through there and looked for absentee fraud cases, absentee ballot cases, and they found 71 as of 2017 across the country. I found another 4 from 2023 to 2022, that time frame. So there's a gap there between 2017 and 2022. But so you're looking at roughly probably 100 or less cases throughout the country. None in Kansas.
None in Kansas. Thank you.
Representative Neighbor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for your testimony today. You said that there were some, was it in Pennsylvania or wherever it was in the east, that had several ballots that they couldn't identify. There were no names on the ballots? And then why would they accept
No, ma'am. It was Bridgeport, Connecticut. And what
Connecticut,
happened
I'm
was,
sorry.
yes, ma'am. Representative, they had a camera of on the outside drop box. It was a remote drop box. And one person made 10 trips to that drop box. Another person made 5. I believe they weren't able to determine how many votes, though you aren't allowed to drop off another person's ballot there. So they were unable to determine how many ballots were at risk of being fraudulent. It was a very close election, so they overturned it. Does that make sense?
It does, but what you said they couldn't verify. So that's
They
why I
couldn't
had that
verify.
question.
Yes, ma'am. They couldn't verify the origin. They couldn't have verified the number of ballots that were delivered inappropriately.
Okay, but those people that voted, they had the names were on the ballots.
I assume so, yes.
Because in the election, when you mail out a ballot, the person voting has to have their name on the ballot. That's why I'm asking that. It's not clear with how you're describing that, so that's why I wondered.
Okay, yeah, I'm not sure, but I feel certain that Connecticut has you put your name on your ballot carrier envelope or whatever system they use.
Okay, because we have that on our ballot, so thank you.
Representative Howell.
Yes, thank you, Chair. So I'm just wondering if you could explain, does Connecticut have any laws set up so they can verify on the end with the actual ballot itself? Do their election officials and their laws and their security policies make it so they can verify that this was a ballot, who it was from? It was a mail ballot that was mailed out to that person in the first place, and it came back as expected, or any of that, or this was solely based on the fact of the videotape from the drop off to the ballot box and no other kind of verification or on the actual ballot?
Yes, Representative. I don't know all the ins and outs of Connecticut law. So, but my understanding of the case is that it was as if someone balloted or violated the 10 ballot rule, as you guys have. So they did not know how many ballots were returned unlawfully. Therefore, the election contest and conviction for voter fraud was upheld. Because there they have I believe a one ballot limit. And obviously someone coming 10 times to the drop box would violate that.
Mr. Vice Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. No, I have a lot that I like about the bill. I'm just wondering, are there other states that you're aware of that have any sort of similar provision, or would this be sort of a ground-breaking effort?
Many states have I think the photo might be a little unique to Kansas, but of course the logging, which I like the best of this, the logging of who brought it in, just their ID numbers. So you have that chain of custody on it. That is not unique to Kansas. A lot of states have that. If you're going to return a ballot, it needs to be logged. That way we know how many ballots were returned. Not only do we not need to know who brought them in, but you also know how many were returned, because in some cases, if you don't have a logging requirement, they end up in a pile beside the clerk, and you'd never really know how many have been returned until someone counts them at some point, and you don't have that on the ground log that shows chain of custody.
All right, committee, if there are no other questions for the proponent, thank you very much, Mr. Ennis. We're going to move on to neutrals. I have one neutral conferee written only, Brett Anderson from We the People, Kansas. Is there anybody wishing to speak as neutral on this bill? Okay, seeing none, we're going to move on to opponents, and our first opponent is Mr. Clay Barker from the Secretary of State's office. Welcome back to the committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Clay Barker from the Kansas Secretary of State's office. I understand the time limit, and I'll be brief as I can be. First, on the overall concept of ballot harvesting, we hear that phrase a lot. Kansas has decided to limit it to one person carrying 10 ballots is okay, 11 is not. Connecticut actually had a different procedure where it's the relationship of the voter to the carrier. Family members could carry it and others. You couldn't give it to someone else. I checked with Mr. Caskey again this morning. Since 1996, there has never been a reported incident in Kansas where a ballot that was returned by mail by any means was not cast by a voter who requested the ballot, filled it out completely, and turned it in. So there's never been an incident of vote fraud by mail. So what I think the ballot harvesting rules are really getting at is overly abusive get-out-the-vote procedures. That's why we don't let candidates collect ballots, and we limit it so somebody can't go through, say, a nursing home, pulling in ballot after ballot after ballot and coercing people. As far as this bill goes, first of all, I've been approached by several people today that have nicknamed this the mugshot bill. But what it would require is anybody who's returning a ballot for someone else would have to go to the county election office and get their picture taken with the ballot and give personal information off their photo ID. First, that's quite a burden. So if my wife had left her ballot on the kitchen counter and said, can you put it in the mailbox at the end of the driveway, I couldn't do that. I'd have to take it all the way down to the county courthouse, go through this, and then drive back. Second, it's been brought up, this personal information and photo, unless it's a driver's license number, which is exempted, is now public record, and anybody could get a hold of it and then perhaps harass somebody that was dropping off ballots. And that would be the end of my testimony, Mr. Chair. I think it's pretty clear where we stand. We oppose this bill. It's just overly burdensome and not bringing a benefit to the system. And I'll stand for questions at the appropriate time.
All right, committee, we're going to go ahead and go through all the opponents, and then we'll call folks back up as we need to. The next opponent that I have listed for oral testimony is Jay Hall from Kansas Association of Counties. Welcome to the committee, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. Jay Hall, Deputy Director and General Counsel for the Kansas Association of Counties. And I want to spend my couple of minutes here at the microphone focusing on the security aspects here. I used to work in the banking industry, and so in the financial industry, you don't collect personal information that you don't need. I thought it was interesting that the proponent even said we might not ever use this information. And from my perspective, as somebody that used to work in the financial sector, you do not collect personal information that you do not need or do not intend to have a purpose for using. Because if you collect that information and something happens to it and that information gets out, you are now responsible to the individual that you collected that information from. And so, again, I would emphasize, just with my background, I think it is a bad policy to collect that type of information if you do not have a purpose to utilize that information. And that's really our concern, because at that point, when you're collecting that information, our county election officers would need to have some sort of plan or protocol for protecting that information and making sure that that information does not in fact fall into the wrong hands, regardless of how that information or when that information is going to be used. And that goes so far as even to make sure that at an appropriate time that information is destroyed if it's no longer being utilized, because again, that's personal information, and if that information gets out 5 years from now, we all know the dangers of identity theft, and so that's a very real risk and something that I don't want to put our county elections officials in the position of putting our voters, our Kansas citizens in the position of having that information exposed. And I'd be happy to answer questions at the appropriate time.
Thank you very much, sir. Our next opponent is Mr. Rick Pifo from Kansas County Clerks and Election Officials Association. Welcome back to the committee, sir.
Yep, thank you. You've already stated who I am. So I'm also the Harvey County Clerk. So I work elections regularly. We have a number of issues with this bill. As you know, it's not always possible for some voters to mail or personally deliver their voted ballots themselves, so they designate a friend or relative or another person to complete the task of getting it delivered to, or they designate the mailman to deliver it to us by dropping it in a mailbox. So these designees that are delivering on behalf of others now would be subjected to coming all the way into the office. They can't drop it in a drop box, even if they sign that they're assisting the voter for delivery. They can't put it in any remote drop box. They would have to come personally into the office, and then we would have to look at their ID, record that information, take their picture with the ballot, and then we have to store all that information and secure that information, as some others have brought up. So we're a little concerned about this, how to secure that and the extra time it's going to take. Currently in my office, we have at our counter, we have glass up that's left from COVID and security glass on our counters. So we have to take now a picture through the glass, or somebody's got to go all the way around, take this picture. It'd be a big inconvenience. I mean, we currently put like a ballot can on the counter that they can bring ballots and deposit them in our office if they want, but we don't personally take the ballots from them. We have them put them in the can. So this would change that procedure, and it would be burdensome. I think Mr. Hall brought up, how long do we secure and retain these records? And then one of my questions would be, when the 10 ballot rule went into effect, we were not necessarily directly charged with enforcing it. We can collect the evidence if people sign more than 10 ballots as assisting. We would have that evidence if an allegation is made. But in this case, and the bill doesn't state it, are we not only collecting that information, but are we then required to compile it and determine if there are violations that then we turn over to law enforcement? And would these records be public records? All these images, would they just be public records under Cora, or would they only be released as evidence? Or we're supposed to, like I said, take it to the sheriff or law enforcement to file charges? I think all these questions need to be answered before we can proceed with this. And otherwise, I'll stand for questions when appropriate.
That was exactly 3 minutes. That was amazing. How did you do that? All right, thank you. Our next conferee or opponent is Mike Burgess, the Director of Policy and Outreach, Disability Rights Center of Kansas. Welcome back to the committee, sir.
And thank you, Mr. Chair. So I will attempt to be very brief, because the other or previous conferees covered a lot of the topic. But kind of the piece I want to add is, as you think about this through the lens of individuals who are homebound, individuals with mobility challenges, dexterity challenges, right now they already have to ask somebody to assist them and then sign the envelope, go through everything. This is going to change that relatively small ask into a much larger ask, because they can no longer just run to the post office to drop it in the mail, if they have the time, or run to the remote ballot box on their behalf. This person now has to go in, have their personal information collected, stand in line, because undoubtedly at busier times, there's going to be a backup. So, I want you to think about it in terms of that person with the disability. We're taking what's a small ask today to ensure their vote is counted, to now creating a barrier for them having to ask somebody to take a much bigger chunk of their time, have their personal information collected, et cetera. So with that's our biggest opposition to this, and just want to make sure that you consider that lens and that impact to people with disabilities. So thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd be happy to stand for questions.
Thank you, sir. Our last there are two more. I apologize. So our next oral opponent is Davis Hammett from Loud Light. Welcome back to the committee, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. Most of my concerns have already been covered. I did want to point out that in the advanced mail ballot process, the entire process is tracked and documented as is. So if there was concern about fraud, for example, that someone would have gone to people's mailboxes, taken out their advanced ballot that was sent to them, and committed fraud, there's already a record and an ability to go back and contact those people in investigation, and now you're talking about a federal mail fraud crime. So there's already things in place, and as we just heard from the Secretary of State, there's no real history or documentation of this ever being an issue. This is a significant civil rights concern, as was said. Not only would it prevent people from being able to assist a variety of people, for example, at a nun house, a nun assisting her elderly sister just to get the ballot to the mailbox, and now they are required to drive to the county clerk and go through this process. But it's very vague on how this data would be protected. As someone who has attempted to do open records requests to all 105 counties, I can tell you they respond dramatically different, and it's hard to not imagine a scenario where personal information about these folks end up getting out either through a clerical error, an open records request, or just simply the vagueness of the laws written. With that, I really think it's not hard to look through this and just see problems everywhere on it, which I think is shown by the line of opponents to this. So without going on, I'm happy to stand for questions when appropriate. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
All right, our final now oral opponent is Eileen Spickler, who is on WebEx, I believe. Ma'am, can you hear me?
I can. Can you hear me?
Yep, please proceed whenever you're ready.
I am. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak. What I wanted to thank everyone for being here today, and also thank you for the opportunity to give testimony. Many people have already addressed most of my concerns, particularly about how this basically increases big government. It puts undue burden on election officials, and there are real security issues. Our real security issues are, we need to protect our government networks because they're getting hacked every day. So that's the one thing. The other issue that I have is that this bill creates a solution for a problem that just doesn't exist. Mr. Ennis talked about in the Brennan Center found 100 issues of voter fraud among how many votes over how many years? That's, to me, a very small number, and my final point is that this really is a further erosion of our voting rights. And this is how countries go down the slippery slope to fascism. That's what happened in Germany. People just stood by, and then all of a sudden it was happening to them. And so in my testimony, I talked about Martin Niemöller. I'm sure everyone is familiar. He was a Lutheran pastor in Germany during World War II. And originally, he was behind Adolf Hitler until he realized really what was going on. And I'd just like to mention that historically, it took about 12 years for Germany to become a fascist country. And what he wrote, and he spoke eventually in his speeches, was the poem First They Came. And I'm going to read it. First they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me. And I'm afraid of something like that happening in our country. Thank you very much, and I respectfully submit my testimony.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you for your testimony. That is the final oral conferee that I have listed. Is there anybody else wishing to speak in person as an opponent on this bill? Okay, seeing none. Committee, are there any questions for any of the opponents? Representative Penn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let's see. I guess there's so many. First, I'd like to make a quick comment. The last conferee, Ms. Eileen Spickler, while I can appreciate her concern, I do find it distasteful to equate proposed language in this bill that does not deal with murdering of 6 million persons, to equate that with the horrific Holocaust of the Jews. I would caution everyone to watch the hyperbole. Number two, perhaps we can go to Mr. Hammett, Davis Hammett. Thanks for your testimony today. Thanks for coming in front of the committee. I followed you a little bit online and everything, and I know that you're a little erudite in some of these areas. So thank you for your time here today. Just wanted to ask you a quick question. When we're looking at this as far as the enforcement piece of it goes, we had one of the conferees say that there is a lack of enforcement, that the original laws on the 10 ballot harvesting thing does not have the enforcement piece, and people are kind of concerned about that. In your mind's eye, would this enforcement mechanism, this language here, would it preclude, like I have about 7 nursing homes or assisted care living homes in my district, would this preclude someone from going in and turning in a number, maybe 50, 80, 100, 250 ballots for President Trump in the next election?
So let me just make sure I understand your question correctly. You're asking if this bill would prevent someone from assisting people with returning their ballots from...
Right, would it curb them from going in and outside of the law that has already been passed? Would it preclude them from going in and turning in election-changing numbers of ballots for Donald Trump?
So I would say that this would actually preclude not just them, but many folks. Right now, even someone in you think of a rural group home where, maybe 11 people are there. Right now, y'all set the standard at 10, and which already creates a challenge, which, full disclosure, we're plaintiffs in a lawsuit against the state on that. But you would actually also be precluding anyone in that circumstance. As was said, so a social worker comes into the home of someone who's paraplegic, and now that social worker wouldn't be able to just assist them with casting their ballot and put it in their mailbox. The social worker would have to take their limited amount of time that they can give to care for that person, would then have to dedicate a part of it to planning out traveling to the election office to do this verification process. And I am not as familiar with that. I think the Disability Rights Center might be more appropriate, but I could imagine a variety of logistical concerns where this bill would disenfranchise disabled folks.
May I? Okay, and for a quick follow-up, and thank you for that. And you're probably right, it is probably Mr. Burgess that might need to speak to this. If we can have him come forward real fast, please. The reason that I bring that up, we heard testimony that there were some difficulties with this, I think from Mr. Pifo, if I say your name correctly, dealing with the COVID protocols. In those 7 that we had, we weren't allowed to go in and talk to people while we were campaigning or see how their ballots were being harvested or anything like that. We had exactly no admittance into those facilities. So would this type of language be, and you can come on and speak on it, in your experience with, or in your estimation, would this type of solution be helpful for us to make sure that we have visibility, security, and integrity in what those voters inside of those facilities are actually doing?
Well, so, excuse me, I personally, our organization doesn't have visibility typically into nursing facilities necessarily. We are a resource if somebody has a complaint or needs help or has a question about their rights. I mean, I see it as erecting barriers. I mean, I kind of said that in my testimony. I think, as one of the previous speakers attempted to answer too, if you have a care worker assisting someone, I mean, they're already limited to hours. You know, often they're trying to do more than the hours they're allotted already. And now this, you know, again, trying to figure out transportation logistics, what's going to happen is they're going to say, well, sorry, I can't help you. And so that individual may not have their vote cast. So I think it's definitely erecting barriers that are going to disenfranchise people as opposed to like a safety and security component of it. And that, to me, is a bigger preponderance, you know, the bigger factor. So thank you.
While you're up there, in the interest of not making you sit down and get back up. So the original, the legislation that we passed a couple years ago that created the 10 ballot limit exempts family members and caregivers from that limit, if I'm correct. Please correct me if I'm wrong, Revisor or Mr. Barker, but I think that there was an exemption for family members and caregivers. If we were to also exempt family members and caregivers from this, this bill doesn't contain that exemption right now. The statute that limits people to turning in 10 ballots exempts family members and caregivers. I believe that's correct. If we were to do the same thing here, exempt family members and caregivers, so, you know, your wife tells you, could you throw it in the mailbox? You can do that. Or you're taking care of people in a nursing home environment or something like that. You're a caregiver. Would that alleviate your concerns at all, or would you still be adamantly opposed to this?
I think, I mean, we'd still be adamantly opposed. Now, in the grand scheme of things, those exceptions would, I mean, that's, you know, compared to the language in the bill, you know, that certainly is a piece that makes it just a skosh better. But you're taking away options. I mean, at the root of this, you're still taking away running to the mailbox. I mean, and any type of assistance, you know, and I guess I'd have questions as far as how it's implemented with, you know, is it because the current language that's stricken is transmittal, and now it's, you know, delivered to the election office. So what does that mean? You know, if somebody has dexterity challenges and they have somebody helping mark their ballot and put it in the envelope and seal it, so can they help with that? I mean, that would be my further question, because is in what part of the process, you know, at this point, they're not transmitting, they're just assisting with the voting, getting it sealed. It looks like the revisor may have an answer on the current exemptions. I know it's family member. I can't remember if caregiver, I don't think caregiver was in there, if I'm remembering, but.
I think this bill just deals with the transmitting, not the help assisting and filling out the ballot. I could be wrong. Mr. Heim, is that a correct reading?
The current law provides no person shall deliver more than 10 advanced ballots on behalf of other voters during an election, meaning turn them in. There is an exemption where you're on behalf of an immediate family member of the candidate and so on. There was a court case that went through the process, and I'm not sure what the status is. I think the Court of Appeals did not provide an injunction, but I can check that.
So my understanding is that, and Mr. Barker can correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is that that piece of that bill that discussed limiting to 10 ballots being turned in was not enjoined. It was the other provisions about pre-filling out ballot requests. I see a north-south nod, so I believe I'm right. So, okay. All right, well, thank you. I think the vice chairman's next.
Yeah, for Rick Pifo, please.
Yes, sir.
Rick, you kind of brought up a very interesting mention in your commentary that so when somebody does bring in ballots, there is a signature, they're supposed to sign it, you know, if it's the person who is bringing it in is also supposed to sign it.
Correct.
And there is no current tracking of that? I don't know.
There is not tracking specifically of the deliverer. I mean, their signature, there's 3 places on the advance envelope that you can sign. There's one for the voter, one for a person assisting, whether that be assisting with delivery or assisting with filling out the ballot. There's a 3rd spot on there for if the voter can't sign, the assister can sign in their place in the 3rd spot. But the second signature is not specifically tracked back to that person because we don't have any other information besides just their signature. I mean, we don't have their voter registration number, their address, their social security number, any of that stuff. So we can't necessarily verify. I mean, somebody could even not be a registered voter and help deliver a ballot.
Okay, I think that answers, I suppose I was thinking of like some way like to have the counties like be logging in that information, but I suppose it's sort of non-trackable that, I mean.
It would be very difficult to track those second signatures. We scan the original, the voter signature.
Right.
And we have a scan, in my case, we have a scan of the whole envelope that we could look at those, or we could go back and look at the envelopes. If there was a question, we could go back through the actual envelopes and find multiple signatures.
Sir, since you're up there, I'm going to hit you with the other question I had. So, and this sort of dovetails off of the vice chairman's question. So when we were hearing the bill about limiting to 10 ballots, I believe that was your testimony that there's no way we can enforce this. You know, you can pass the law, but how are we going to enforce it? If I remember correctly.
It'd be difficult. Yeah.
Okay. I understand and agree that the mug shot is perhaps excessive, but we heard the proponent say that it is not uncommon in other states for election offices to be required to log who turned in ballots. If we were, if we were to do away with the picture and just require that election offices are logging who's turning in ballots and how many with the name and the driver's license number, which you already have because that's from the registration, so it's not, would you be any more comfortable with this or would you still be opposed?
It would still cause some extra workload, I guess, or because currently, like I said, we have a ballot box that sits at the counter that even if we're not watching that box every moment, somebody could deposit a ballot in that envelope. And we have occasions where people will bring them in, and I mean, even though we're right there, we'll find a ballot in the can that was unsigned. So then we have to contact them, get their signature. So we in my office are not constantly monitoring that box. Now, I suppose if we move the box away, and then they have to ring the bell if somebody's not at the counter, and then we have to say, okay, here, sign this. But I think there's also the burden on that person delivering. You're making them come all the way into my office. Parking at our courthouse is not the best. So now they have to find a parking space, come all the way into the office, and then sign that they're delivering this ballot. Like I said, we do have the evidence, and we do log. He was talking about a spreadsheet to track how many you have. We do log all these ballots as they're returned. In my case, we do it every day. We scan them and log them into the system that the ballot has been received. So we know how many ballots are coming in and how many we sent out.
So I guess my concern is, I mean, there was a legislative intent to the 10 ballot rule.
Correct.
And I understand that it is additional work, but we're either going to enforce that law or we're not going to enforce that law.
Right, but I guess the real question, I mean, county clerks or election officials are not law enforcement. So now do we just, collect and compile this, turn it over to law enforcement, or we do citizen's arrest? Or?
I mean, you do, I mean, please, I'm not trying to like, I would like to hear your response to this. You are enforcing the law at every polling place when you require somebody to show an ID before you give them a ballot, aren't you?
Correct. I mean, but there where, if they don't show it, they're not allowed to vote, or they have to vote provisionally. We're still allowing them to vote, we're following the law, but we're not charging them with a crime. Because we're not allowing them to commit a crime.
You had a question? Representative Meyer.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This might actually be for Clay Barker, if that's okay. Hi, Clay, thanks for being here. I was just wondering if you had any idea how many additional FTEs this might cost each of the individual counties and clerks' offices across the state.
Representative, that I do not know. It didn't affect our office, so we didn't estimate it.
Do you know where we may be able to get that information? It seems like it would be a very, there would be a lot more employees needed to do this.
I would imagine so, Representative, because some counties only have maybe 2 staff on their county clerk. And Mr. Chair, if I could just quickly follow up on something. So when the legislature put the 10-person limit, and it is just 10 people, the family piece was a candidate could collect their immediate family's ballot. The legislature had an option that they just chose not to do, was the relationship to the voter. So the voter can only give it to a family member, caregiver, co-resident. But the entities that probably were collecting more than 10 ballots a person, and I did this for years with the state Republican Party, are candidates, political parties, PACs, and C4s. And they were hustling to get mail ballots. Everyone did it. Now the legislature has put a strict limit on it, and those organizations have told their people, you will not violate that limit. What we didn't have was evidence of some dark, nefarious group doing it in the middle of the night, which would be very hard to catch because, as I've said before, if I was going to stuff a ballot, I wouldn't put it in a drop box. I'd go put it in a post office box where there's no camera and spread it around. It's a very hard limit to enforce, but the people that may have been doing it in the past have all put out strict orders not to do it. So I think it has had an effect on the campaigns.
But the reason we don't have any evidence of anybody nefarious doing it in the dark is because we're not tracking. So we don't know, right?
We don't know, but
okay. I think Representative Neighbors next, and I think committee, I'm going to have to make this the last question because we still have one more bill to hear, and I'm hoping to get some bills worked today.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My question is for Jay Hall. Thank you for your testimony today. Sounds like you have a lot of experience in private information and gathering that. One of the things I think you mentioned was it's not wise to take driver's license numbers. Did you mention something about that precisely?
I think I said it's not prudent to collect personal information if you're not going to use it. So I think it's fine to collect that information if you have a specific use, but if you're just collecting it for the sake of collecting it and you may not actually use it for any purpose, I don't think that's prudent.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I'd like to add one thing. The quote by the lady that spoke, she happens to be my constituent, and nowhere in here does it say 6,000 of anything. And I just think that's a leap beyond what we're talking about, and would like to just make that point of clarification.
Thank you, Representative.
Thank you.
All right. I'd like to thank all the conferees, both who appeared in person and written, for your testimony today. And I'm going to close the hearing on House Bill 2572 and open the hearing on House Bill 2571. If we could get a rundown from the reviser, sir.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, this is another bill dealing with advanced voting ballots, and the gist of the bill appears on page 3. It provides that an advanced voting ballot transmitted to the county election office by being deposited in a remote ballot box shall be endorsed with the word provisional on the back. In other words, if it's in a remote ballot box, it's going to be considered a provisional ballot. And it would require the election officer to verify that the voter whose name appears on the envelope has deposited the ballot and so on. And if not, then the vote wouldn't be counted.
Committee, so I'd like to limit questions for Mr. Heim to what the bill actually says. If you've got questions about the impact of the bill, I'd like you to save them for the conferees. So are there any questions on what the bill says for the reviser? Okay, thank you very much. Our first proponent is Mr. Chad Ennis on WebEx. Welcome back to the committee.
Thank you, Chairman. This bill is targeted to, and again, this is Chad Ennis, Honest Elections Project. This bill is targeted, I think, towards the same problems that the other bill is targeted to. Again, it's creating some extra procedures to put in place where we have ballots that we don't know where they come from. And in this case, these are ballots being deposited in a remote ballot box outside the view of an election official. And it would say, well, if that's going to happen, you're going to mark it provisional, so it gets a little extra scrutiny to make sure that that ballot is coming from the voter whose name's on the ballot, because it was returned without any supervision or logging or any of those things we talked about previously. So we think it's a good thing. It adds more transparency to the election, more accountability, and it will make the elections more secure. And I think all of the other points I made earlier about some of the problems with absentee ballots we've seen and with fraud in general remain valid. And I won't go through those in the interest of time. So with that, I'll take questions or be finished with my testimony.
Thank you, sir. So the other two proponents that I have listed are written only. I would direct the committee's attention to those later. Is there anybody wishing to speak as a proponent on House Bill 2571? Okay, seeing none, committee, are there any questions for Mr. Ennis? Representative Oropeza.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you again for your testimony, Mr. Ennis. Earlier, I didn't ask, where do you currently reside?
I'm in Austin, Texas.
Austin, Texas. Okay. And again, do you have any data of this being an issue in the state of Kansas?
Again, there have been no cases of absentee ballot fraud that we've seen in Kansas.
Thank you.
Any other questions? So, Mr. Ennis, I've got a question about kind of the consequences of this. So, and maybe some of the opponents can correct me if I'm wrong in my analysis here, but the provisional ballots in Kansas don't get counted until the canvass well after the election. And so if we have thousands of ballots that come in drop boxes and don't get counted until the canvass after a candidate's already been declared the presumptive winner, and then it reverses the election or switches the election, might that have the unintended consequence of reducing voter confidence rather than increasing it?
I think that's a concern. And I think the answer to that would be to hopefully shorten your provisional ballot window if possible. One thing we've seen that works in other states on this as well is to also publicize and make very clear to the public how many provisional ballots are outstanding and also how many mail ballots are outstanding. I think across the country, we do not do a good job of this. So the folks know, hey, candidate A is ahead by 200 votes tonight, but we've got all these other ballots that we have to process in the meantime. So I think that's a great point. I would suggest that instead of doing something to this, I would suggest, moving up when you can start to review provisional ballots and clear them so they can be cleared on election night or even earlier as needed to get them into the kitty and make sure they get counted timely.
All right, any other questions for Mr. Ennis? Okay, seeing none, thank you for your testimony, sir. All right, committee, I don't have any neutral conferees listed. Is there anybody wishing to speak as neutral to this bill? Okay, seeing none, I'll move on to the opponents, and our first in-person opponent is Mr. Clay Barker.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Clay Barker, General Counsel, Kansas Secretary of State, and we are also opposed to this bill, and briefly for two reasons. First of all, the remote boxes have become more and more popular in Kansas. And right now, and I did a survey of some of the counties, so I'm not going to bet my paycheck on these estimates, but about 40 to 50% of mail ballots are now delivered by remote box as opposed to postal box. And I believe that's because the public is lacking faith in the Postal Service. And that would be especially the larger counties where there might be more. Now, most counties only have 1 or 2 boxes. They're not popping up like mushrooms. Now, provisional ballots, in the 2022 election, there were about 17,000. Extrapolating how many there will probably be in the general and 2024 presidential election, where about a third of your voters only vote once every 4 years, we're looking at 22,000, maybe 25,000. If these ballots that are put in remote boxes follow the trends, we're talking about adding in another 70,000 provisional ballots just because they were deposited in a box. And usually provisional ballots are provisional because there's something challengeable in them. The voter's not on the registration list. There's maybe reason to believe they've already voted once and you want to make sure. Things of that nature that are specific. So it's a much larger burden on the counties, and it's a burden because the statute requires the county to verify the ballot, and we don't know what that means. Right now, for a mail ballot to go out, first the requester, the voter, has to request it. Unlike a lot of states that just mail it out, they have to give their signature, driver's license, and show they're a registered voter. And the election staff verify the signature and the driver's license number. Most states only use one or the other of those two procedures. Then when the ballot's mailed out and it's returned, you again verify the signature and that the voter requested the ballot to make sure it links up and that they're still a registered voter. I don't know what else this bill means by verifying the ballot. I can only imagine it has to be something in addition to that, which would be trying to call 70,000 voters or write them or email them, and that would be a huge burden to place on the counties. And again, I'm just not sure what that word verify means. And again, Mr. Chair, you pointed out the swing in the possible canvass results, that election night would now not be about 97% of the vote, it'd be a lot less, and you could see a pretty big swing in the outcome. And I'll stand for questions at the appropriate time.
All right, thank you, sir. Our next opponent is Mr. Rick Pifo. Welcome back.
Thank you. I think Mr. Barker's already covered a lot of this, and a lot of it was covered in the previous bill. It would definitely be burdensome to take all of these that are deposited in remote boxes and then have to process them in the time frame that we have to process provisional ballots. And in our county, about 1/3 of our total mailed advance ballots are returned by what I would classify as a remote drop box, the 2 that are outside available 24 hours. I have an issue with the term remote ballot box that's in my testimony because it talks about in the election office or satellite early voting site or not, but what about non-satellite early voting? I brought this up yesterday. But so in my case, in 2022 general election, we had 163 traditional provisional ballots that were voted either early in person or on election day. And then we also had 743 that were deposited in a remote ballot box, which included the boxes at the polling places. So we would add an additional 743 ballots that we would have to go through and try to verify, but it's not clear how do we verify. Is that a phone call? And what is the time frame to get that resolved? Currently, if they're unsigned, they have up until the canvass to get them corrected, to be counted. So do they have the same kind of time frame to verify that their ballot should be counted, that it really was them that deposited it? I would also like to point out that I noticed, and maybe I'm incorrect, but there's a section in here on page 3, lines 38 through 42, that seemed to prevent the counting of any ballot deposited in a remote ballot box, which directly contradicts the reason for, or the need for all this provisional, because it says if it's deposited in a remote ballot box, it will not be counted. So there's no reason to have it be provisional, I guess. I would stand for questions when appropriate.
But we didn't ban the ballot box, so.
Right.
No.
But this would have,
I understand.
it would effectively
I
ban
couldn't
ballot
resist.
boxes.
I apologize. All right, I'm going to get us back on track, I promise, committee. Thank you very much. Our next conferee is Mr. Mike Burgess.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And again, I will attempt to be very brief. There are a significant number of individuals with disabilities who utilize advanced ballots by mail today and have their ballots, just like a lot of other people, have somebody either bring it back or they bring it back and use the remote box. So as you look at that additional verification process, obviously not all these people have cell phones or email. And so I think it's going to create an additional burden. Invariably, it's going to have a disproportionate impact on people with disabilities and could lead to their votes not being counted. So that's something that we take very seriously and have strong opposition to. And so with that, I would be happy to stand for questions at the appropriate time.
Thank you, sir. And the last in-person conferee that I have listed as an opponent is Mr. Davis Hammett. Welcome to the committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. Again, echoing a lot of the concerns that have already been presented. I also have concerns about how this might comply with HAVA because the voter essentially won't know that their ballot is provisional or how to know that their ballot was or was not counted. As was said, there's provisional ballots are an issue that I've worked on for a long time, and they're very misunderstood by the public. There's a common misconception that casting a provisional ballot means your ballot won't be counted. The vast majority of provisional ballots are counted. For example, all the time, maybe a poll worker just missed your name on the list, you cast a provisional ballot, back at the election office, they see, yes, they were registered, they just missed them. That's the easy example. But to process provisional ballots, it does take time. And as was, what's been alluded to here, we're not just talking about the amount of time, the amount of resources that you're talking about and the delay in results. I mean, we hear concerns about the number of ballots that come in during the 3-day grace period. I mean, that is like a drop compared to what this would be of tens of thousands of ballots, where really this bill would make it so, assuming that it could even be technically implemented, that it did comply with federal law, that basically every election in Kansas, you really wouldn't be able to call an outcome on election night. You wouldn't be able to call outcomes for weeks after election day. So for those reasons and more, broadly, we oppose this bill. But I will say in agreement sort of with the proponent that I do think that's a good idea, that there should be more transparency in how many ballots are outstanding and to the ability of the county clerk, how many provisional ballots they have of a preliminary count, because that is helpful information for the public and for candidates. Thank you.
Thank you to all the opponents who appeared in person. I've got, you can see on your agenda are listed other folks that have submitted opposition testimony written only. Is there anybody wishing to speak as an opponent on this bill? Okay, seeing none, I'll open it up to questions. Committee, does anybody have any questions for the opponents? Representative Neighbor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is for, Davis. Do you know of any agencies that already provide that kind of information at the, as far as provisionals and things? How many are out? Do you know of any groups or agencies that do that already here in Kansas?
So preliminary, it varies. Counties use different systems, and frankly, this is maybe a question that the Secretary of State and county clerks might be more able to answer, and I've been in litigation with some of them over this in the past. But it generally does vary because also they have to categorize them in it takes them a while because this is all, in most places, this is done manually. I mean, we're talking about them having to like deal with stacks of paper and entering it into a database. So it's not as easy as just pulling them in and saying, here's how many are left. And that's why I meant even getting that estimate would require some resources and processes to be put in place.
Well, I can tell you that there are some people that do that, and they do it on a daily basis, and they will mail you that information as to how many ballots are out there, how many are left to come in. In Johnson County, it's available to anybody that wants it. I don't know about the other counties, but I can say that is available in some areas. Thank you.
Mr. Pifo, I saw you nodding. Do you want to say anything? I didn't mean to interrupt, Mr. Hammett. Did you have a?
Just really briefly, I was going to say that was, I was actually a plaintiff in the case. It was Hammett v. Metzger that made that data available in 2019. I believe we succeeded, so.
It's not there anymore.
Taking a victory lap.
I'm not. And I think some of those daily numbers are about advance and outstanding advance ballots, but provisionals are harder to do because they have to be classified, as Mr. Hammett said. But I'm not sure about all the counties, but on my website, at least when I'm doing my final posting on election night, I say how many outstanding or how many provisional ballots we have. When everything's done, I say we had 163 total provisional ballots, 117 of those counted. When everything's done, I can tell you how many provisionals there are for each precinct or ballot style. But after election, I have our canvass 1 week after Election Day. So we have that time frame that we have to group those ballots, log them in the system, figure out what precinct they were. So sometimes it's difficult to give it a breakdown by precinct or style, which would be direct to a particular race that you may not be on all the ballots in the county. But I think a number of counties do try to put those numbers out there.
Representative Howell.
Thank you, Chair, and I'm sorry, Rick, my question's for you too. I apologize. You sat down too soon. So it is my understanding that under current law and practice, in how we run our elections in the state of Kansas, that mail ballots that are delivered by the United States Postal Service and mail ballots that are delivered through a ballot box are treated to the exact same security verification protocols. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. So this law, if it was to be implemented as written, would treat mail ballots that are delivered by ballot box differently and would be discriminating, in fact, against voters that are using ballot boxes versus those who just chose to randomly throw them in the USPS post office box. Is that
It would be a different standard for those that deliver them in person to a remote box that actually has a shorter chain of custody than going through the mail. In the mail, it could be hundreds of people touching those ballots. In our case, it's only a few.
And in your professional opinion, do you think this would open us up for lawsuits and court cases?
Don't know, I'm not a lawyer, and I didn't stay at a Motel 6 or whatever, so.
All right, Representative Penn, and committee, unless somebody's got an issue that they just can't live if they don't ask, this will be the last question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the grace. This is for Clay Barker, please. So, thank you for coming before us, and thanks for your time. Make it quick. Nature abhors a vacuum. We implemented certain laws. They've been passed, and some of them are in litigation injunction. But the enforcement provisions of those, and that's basically what these two bills are trying to get at. And I sit on the Joint Rules and Regulations Committee, and here you've appeared before us. Going back again to nature abhorring a vacuum, in the absence of the agency, Secretary of State, promulgating some type of enforcement mechanism or cleanup, if that will be, here's what we get. The question to you, sir, is will your office offer some type of language that will get after what the problem is that these are trying to solve? If these are that distasteful in opposition, what can we do there?
Representative, we could sit down and talk about various options on that. Is just enforcing that this one person can only carry 10 ballot rule is difficult. And no matter, my personal opinion is no matter what rules we put in, it's easy to evade. Because somebody could have 10 ballots and just put one in a post office box, one each night, and you'd never know it. But I'd be happy to discuss ideas with you on that
So
and strategies other states have used.
please correct me if I'm wrong, but the Secretary of State doesn't necessarily have the ability to regulate the election clerks on this unless we give them that authority, correct?
That's correct, Mr. Chair.
So that you can't promulgate regulations on this right now?
Not on this issue. No, we don't have authority.
Thank you. All right, thank you to all the conferees committee. Is there anybody who is not going to be able to sleep all weekend if they don't get to ask another question of the opponents? Okay, because I would hate to be responsible for that. All right, I'm going to close the hearing on House Bill 2571. And committee, I'd like to try to work at least one, if not two bills. And the first one is House Bill 2559, which is the bill on the use of AI in campaigns. Mr. Reviser, please remind us what we're talking about.
This bill basically, which is sponsored by yourself and Representative Vic Miller, amends the two different crimes of corrupt political advertising. One appears in the general election crimes article, which is Article 24, and the other one appears in the Campaign Finance Act. And basically, it's intended to prohibit the use of synthetic media or AI in an election campaign where you basically distort the image or appearance or speech of an elected official or a candidate. And there's been some folks that have been in contact with you, Mr. Chairman, and myself about some suggested amendments. I've distilled those suggestions into two very similar amendments, actually, and I can pass those out. One was by the Broadcasters Association, and the other one was the lobbying group Frederico and Durst. And I think, anyway, I can get those passed out.
If you'd pass those out while we're entertaining questions. So are there any questions for the reviser? Okay, the chair would entertain a motion so that we can open discussion on this. Do I have a motion on this bill? 2559.
Mr. Chairman, I would move that we pass House Bill 59, excuse me, favorably for passage. Yeah.
Okay, I've got a second from Representative Underhill. Okay, so committee, to open the discussion, I do have an amendment here.
At the top of the page is who suggested the amendment, and I think you've got the one by the.
All right, so the purpose of this amendment is to address the conversation that the issue that one of the conferees had. The intent of this bill is to hold the producer of the content accountable. And several of the conferees were concerned that the transmitter of the content, being radio, television, or internet service, might be held liable for the distribution of this material. And so what this does, this first amendment does, which is the one that says Frederico Durst on it, is that amendment addresses this issue by exempting the deliverer of the material, being the radio station, the television network, the ISP, exempts them from liability under this bill. And so that's the purpose of the amendment. Mr. Reviser.
I would suggest, and I probably, after all this was copied and so on, thought better of how I presented it. But if you would turn to page 2 of each amendment, and you can see them side by side, they're basically the same amendment. I think the broadcasters is a little more general and maybe covers everything, but the two can be combined actually into one amendment if that was the desire of the committee. But you can see the language if you turn to page 2 of both of the handouts there. One's a broadcaster, the other's a Federico Durst lobbying group.
Okay, so both of these do the same thing is what you're saying. Okay, so which do you like more, Mike?
I like the broadcasters better, but, because I think it's broader, but I could add the Federico stuff into that and make it into one amendment.
Okay. All right, is there, I will move the amendment and then a combination of these two, and then do I have a second for the amendment so we can start talking about the amendment? Okay. Second from Vice Chairman. Discussion? Representative Dodson.
I just want to kind of raise an issue that I thought about a couple of days ago on this, and that is, you know, we've had hearings in D.C. with Facebook and Twitter and things like this, and essentially what their defense is, geez, I'm only the guy who's passing along this content. I have no responsibility for policing anything. So I think we ought to just keep that in mind at the same time of absolving people of responsibility who perhaps ought to know better.
And I've been very frustrated with the news coverage on this bill, and I learned a really important lesson through this process, which is I need to really, really read the short description, because I think a lot of the media outlets just read the short description, which says prohibiting the use. If you read down in the bill, the affirmative defense is to label it, right? So we're not telling anybody on earth that they can't use AI-generated images, video, speech, whatever, in their advertising. We're just requiring that they label it as such. And so I would be very, if we were trying to prohibit the content, I would share your reservation, but I think the fact that we're just requiring that it have the label the same as any ad has to say paid for, but that's my 2 cents.
I guess the kind of the rest of the issue here would be who's responsible for putting the label on there, and then who is responsible for ensuring that the label that should be on there is on there.
I think that this amendment makes it clear that it's the person who produced the content is responsible for putting the label on, and if it's campaign finance stuff, the ethics is responsible for enforcing. If it's somebody trying to deceive voters as to how to vote or where to vote, it's the Attorney General's office.
I can amend the title of the bill if you amend the bill so that it doesn't, there's more of a clarification about what the bill does. Anyway, instead of prohibiting, I would say maybe regulating, but I'll deal with it so it's
Please
not.
do, so that I stop getting kicked around by the newspapers. Representative Underhill.
I just wanted to make note that with the wording in the 2 amendments that I think, like Revisor Heim, that if they accomplish the same thing, that the one by the Association of Broadcasters is a little bit more inclusive as far as media and that sort of thing, where the other one just says radio and cable for the most part.
Yeah.
Vice Chairman.
Yeah, just to underscore that, I mean, it seemed like the broadcaster's amendment would encompass anything that the Federico Durst does. It's more inclusive and covers the whole topic rather than a specific type of broadcasting.
Okay, so I think I feel a consensus forming here. I think I'll amend my motion to, I am moving the amendment that was written for the Kansas Association of Broadcasters. And will you renew your second, Mr. Vice Chairman? Okay. Is there any more discussion on the amendment? Okay, seeing none, I'll close on my amendment. All those in favor of the amendment, please signify by saying aye. All those opposed, no. Okay, the amendment passes. We are back on the bill. Is there any discussion on the bill as amended? Mr. Vice Chairman.
Just to clarify, so we have from the reviser that the description will be revised so that it more clarifies that it's not a complete ban of AI. It's just proper.
Right, I'll amend the title to better reflect what the bill actually does. And it may be a little longer title as a result, but that's fine.
More descriptive, please. Is there any other discussion on the bill as amended? Okay, seeing none, Mr. Vice Chairman, will you
Yes,
renew your motion as amended?
Mr. Chairman, I move that we pass House Bill 2559 as amended for favorably for passage.
Okay, and Representative Dodson seconds. Is there any further discussion? Okay, seeing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye. All those opposed, no? Okay, the bill passes. So committee, I'd also, since we've got a few minutes and I don't think it's going to be complicated, I would like to try to work House Bill 2518. And Mr. Reviser, if you could give us a rundown.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, this is a bill, the concept's been around for several years and considered by this committee and in the Senate as well. But what it would do is provide that the Secretary of State, after consultation with county election officers, shall adopt rules and regulations for the use of remote ballot boxes by county election officers and so on. And the testimony was, and concern was that July 1, 2024 is too quick to try and get rules and regulations. So the amendment would provide on or before January the 1st, 2025.
Okay, the chair would entertain well, first of all, are there any questions about what the bill says for Mr. Heim? Okay, the chair would entertain a motion on this bill. Mr. Vice Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, I move that we take House Bill 2518 and move it forward favorably for passage.
Okay, a second by Representative Dodson, who beat Representative Underhill by a quarter second. All right, committee discussion. I'd like to open the discussion by moving this amendment, which the reviser has already explained eloquently. Is there a second for my motion to amend? There's a second from Representative Dodson. I'm sorry, I'm going too fast, Cheryl. I'll slow down. Is there any discussion on the amendment? Okay, seeing none, we should always do things at Thursday, 10 minutes before the end of the committee. All right, seeing no discussion, I'll move my motion. Is there, all those in favor of amending signify by saying aye. All those opposed, no. Okay, the ayes appear to have it. The bill is amended. We're back on the bill as amended. Is there any discussion on the bill? Okay, seeing none, will you renew your motion?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I move that House Bill number 2518 as amended be moved favorably for passage.
Representative Dodson renews his second. All those in favor signify by saying aye. All those opposed, no. Okay, the ayes appear to have it. The bill is passed favorably. All right, committee, that concludes our work for the day. Is there anything for the good of the order? All right, Mr. Heim.
The bill that was passed out earlier, 2512, dealing with the requirement for in-person advance voting and so on, I had to make it into a substitute bill. The amendments are just exactly what the committee asked for, but our KLIS system didn't like the idea of an amendment, so it became a substitute bill, which is an amendment. It's a form of amendment. But so if you see a substitute for House Bill 2512, it is what the committee did.
The chair trying to pull a fast one. Okay. Are there anything else for the good of the order? All right, seeing none, we are adjourned.